Okay, so we're filming video again because it was fun last time I did it, so I wanted to do it again. However, this time I'm kind of a little bit more scripted, so I do have my laptop over here and I hope that it doesn't end up being annoying. I'm gonna try and speak to the camera as much as I can, but at the end of the day, I kind of cater more towards what I say than video. Video can be it's just a little bit fun. It was fun last time, so I thought I would see how this goes, more scripted. Anyways, we'll move on. So for today's episode, we're going to be talking about a very specific English rock band, and we're going to be doing this because I've always had this weird hyper specific obsession with rock bands that came from the UK. I just think that they're usually very good, and it's not to say anything about any other country because I love music from everywhere and rock from everywhere, but there's a couple bands that I really, really like, so I thought we would do this because I have a trip coming up in England. I have a trip coming up in July to England, and doing that, I've been adding little music landmarks to my list to go see, and it's just reignited this whole obsession. So I wanted to take some time throughout this summer to go through some of my favorite English rock bands. Not every single week though, because I don't want to bore anyone or make it super annoying. But we also, I feel like, haven't done something music based in a while, so I just thought it seemed fun. So we're gonna do that. And I figured what's a better place to start than debatably where it all began. The beloved Beatles. Now, the Beatles for me are a band that have become one of my favorites, like honestly just within maybe a year and a half now. Obviously, I always knew who the Beatles were, as does everyone, but they weren't a band that necessarily meant a lot to me until they did mean a lot to me, and that impact has just kind of made a big difference in my life. And so because of that, they've become a big kind of part of my music appreciation. I don't know. I don't really know what else to call it. So even though they're the biggest band in the world, we will debatably, in a lot of people's opinion, I will be going over like a brief summary of who they are, but before we do that, we need to address the ambivalence of the Beatles, because everywhere I went when I was researching for this episode had two opposing opinions. Either the Beatles are the best band in the world and this is why, or the Beatles did nothing good and they shouldn't have touched a microphone and this is why. So I thought it was interesting, just kind of the drastic difference. And I know with anything big, you're going to have people who dislike it and people who like it. And probably some of this stuff online is rage bait, but it's just interesting to me because it's so opposing. You know, people don't just dislike the Beatles. They hate the Beatles. And I just wanted to know why, because I'm not like even putting them in my top 10 favorite artists, but I definitely like them and I definitely seek out their music. So I just wonder like what makes people despise them. So in order to do this, I had to completely submerge myself into this community and I became a Beatles hater so that I could give you the best information you can on why this has happened. So I listened to as much YouTube videos as I could on why people think the Beatles suck, and I read as many articles as I could on why the Beatles suck, and I watched all the TikToks I could on why the Beatles suck. So I found 3 different things that showed up quite a lot. Number 1, they suck because they're not the best band ever. Number 2, they suck because they're not rock and roll and they actually just make nursery rhymes. And number 3, they suck because they're just boring and they didn't do anything interesting. So before we totally get into that, I need to get this out of the way because there's a term going around on the internet a lot lately, and it's called glazing, and it's basically sucking up to someone. Like, you look at them and your eyes are just glazed with awe for them. Like, they can do nothing wrong. And I'm not going to sit here and say that there isn't any Beatles fans that do that, because there definitely is, but, that's just part of having a big audience. It's part of being a fan to an extent. I mean, like, I'm not going to defend every artist, but I'll defend Suki Waterhouse till the day I die. So, I feel like you probably have someone who you do the same for. So now we've got that out of the way. I'm not doing this. I'm not glazing the Beatles. I'm just defending them. Okay, so reason number 1 is the Beatles suck because they're not the best band that's ever been a band. Like I said earlier, we all have our favorite artists, and when we have a favorite artist, it's based on our taste. It's based on our experience in life, how we connect to them, if we like the way their music sounds, and all of that's based on the things that we have experienced. It's not based on their success as a band. We choose our favorite band based on what we enjoy, not if they have 1 million followers. I guess that's not really enough. Sorry. It's not really a lot in today's age is what I'm trying to say, but it doesn't matter anyways because that's not the point. The point is, we don't pick people based on their success when it comes to the music that we like to enjoy. So, if you were to tell me that you love Led Zeppelin and you were arguing that Led Zeppelin is a better band than the Beatles, I'd be hard pressed to disagree with you, but that's because I like Led Zeppelin too. So it's not just because one band, in our opinion, my opinion or your opinion, is better than another, doesn't mean that other band is bad. That's just kind of what I'm trying to say. So therefore, it's fair of you to say that maybe the Beatles were not the best band ever in rock and roll, but that doesn't mean that they were a bad band. That doesn't mean that they didn't influence music and culture, and that doesn't mean that they had no impact on the way that rock eventually developed in our society. But say your argument is more like the Beatles were not rock and roll and they made soft music for little toddlers. Now I can understand where this thought comes from, though I still disagree. I think it's mostly agreed upon that everything in life continues to evolve, be that for good or for bad. But what tends to happen when we're consuming something that's addictive is we build a tolerance. So the more of it we get, the lesser effect it has. So we crave more and more and more so that it has that same effect that it once did. And the same is true about music. So the more you hear one type of sound, the less unique it becomes. Therefore, a song that maybe was once groundbreaking and new is kind of stale and old now. So with this understanding of the evolution in music, of course, the Beatles' sound of rock music sounds nothing like maybe someone would consider to be rock music nowadays, because there's been years and years of evolution and so many subgenres that have come off of rock that have created their own space. But again, just because Biggie Smalls and Jid don't sound anything really alike doesn't mean that they're both not hip-hop or rap. So I think you could probably argue if the Beatles created rock and roll, but I don't think you can argue that they didn't contribute to an entire culture of rock and roll. Again, it's okay if you don't like their music, or if their music is too soft for your interpretation of what rock music should be. However, the Beatles on a whole were definitely a rock band. Now for the last argument. The Beatles' music is boring. So I actually respect this opinion the most out of all of them. I still strongly disagree, but I can absolutely see where you're coming from. The Beatles' success was in a completely different time of life than we're living in now, and more than just musically. Their access to recording equipment was completely different, and they talked about maybe a lot of mind-numbing things like love and losing the girl. Things that didn't necessarily come across as the deepest concepts to write about, and I think that's all fair and true, and I can agree with that. But to you, I'd say, is boredom bad? Is a simpler idea necessarily a bad one? Because personally, the older I get and the more I consume media, the more I kind of want to seek out quietness in life. Like, don't get me wrong, I love a good album dissection. You can catch me listening to every 40-minute dissect podcast of every Kendrick song ever, and I will indulge myself in it. But despite what some people think, I do think that some of the Beatles lyrics could be dissected. However, as John Lennon did point out and make a purposeful example of with I Am the Walrus, some music is just not meant to be dissected. Some music is just simple. And again, if you don't like it, there's no issue with that. But the simple fact that it's boring does not prove that it's bad. Now, this is not a platform that I ever really want to use for hate, because I think that music is very personal and it's based on self-expression, and while I might not like every single song I ever hear, I always try to understand where they're coming from, because at the basis of a song is a human. It's someone's experience, and even if I can't personally relate to it, like, someone does relate to it and it means a lot to them. So I bring this all up because I found a common issue when I was exploring both sides of the argument. Were the Beatles a good or bad band? You know, you have the people that I've been talking about that say the Beatles make irritating music for toddlers. And then I found that the response, I just didn't like it. It quite often was, well, how can you have an opinion on that when what you listen to isn't even music? And I don't like that response. I have the biggest issue with this because nobody is right in this circumstance, in my opinion. Both parties are taking preference and they're making it fact. Now, preference is not fact. Taste is not fact. It's based on what we think is good, and that's based on, like I said, our experience in life. It's based on all the other artists we grew up listening to and what we chose to like the most from those and what we chose to explore. So I just really encourage you to always listen to music with an open heart and an open mind, because I think that the best experiences with music of getting something out of them is when you least expect it. And Rick Rubin, a famous producer that I will happily take part in glazing over. Can't use it. I don't know. I didn't use that terminology correctly, but it's not the point. Anyways, he said this: living in discovery is at all times preferable to living through assumptions. And this is not to say that I'm right and you're wrong. It's just to strongly urge you to never close your mind off to a musician. Even to all those Beatles lovers out there that are listening to this, just because you like the Beatles doesn't mean that modern music has no value. So, even if you don't particularly enjoy Beatles music, the impact of the band on music has to be made an example of. They're one of the strongest cases for exemplifying how the creative mind works together. Like how one person has a good idea and then someone can make it better, and how four really brilliant minds can come together and make something that no one else in the world could have made because it was the four of them doing it together. And I think we underlook this quality, but it tends to come up quite a lot in our lives. Like, even if you feel like you're not creative, this comes up in marketing, it comes up in business, it comes up in organizing and planning, like working together in a creative way to find a solution to something is a big part of a lot of the things we do in society. So I just think that beyond the music that the Beatles contributed to the world, this is the reason that people talk about them so much, is because of how difficult it is to do that and how well they did that for quite a short amount of time. Actually, I was going to say a long time, but as we'll get into later, it's actually not that long. But if that's not enough of a reason for the Beatle haters to stay, how about the influence of Kurt Cobain on music and society? Why are we talking about Nirvana all of a sudden? Well, I will let you know why we're talking about Nirvana, and it is because you can find numerous accounts of Kurt Cobain expressing his gratitude and love for the Beatles and claiming their levels of inspiration on him throughout quite a lot of his life, leading to songs like About a Girl and his cover of And I Love Her. Even though they're playing two different fields, game recognizes game at the end of the day. And that's why if you're a Beatles hater, I want you to stay, because matter of fact is that music is more than just noise. Music has the power to change how we feel and impact so much of our lives. I mean, surely if the lead singer of Oasis has something nice to say about the Beatles, then I think that you can find something nice to say about the Beatles. And lastly, one thing that you'll commonly find is the group of people who regard the Beatles as good musicians are musicians. And I think that's kind of more than I could ever say. And if you're still not with me, then no worries, all good. You can click off this video. You don't have to watch it. There's no harm. But I will leave you with the question, how would music sound today if it wasn't for the Beatles? All right. Now that we've sat through this extremely long introduction, we will actually talk about the Beatles themselves. I think that it's almost important to see the Beatles as two separate bands when we're talking about them. Firstly, the ones who, made the nations fall in love with them with songs like Love Me Do. And then the second version of the Beatles that challenged your beliefs about life and your beliefs about what you considered to be music. They quickly transitioned from the beloved young teenage band as all those screaming girls. And I can relate to this. It's a historical fact that fangirls have always existed. And I see you, I hear you to all those girls back then, because I understand. But anyways, they transitioned from this band to a band that art would one day alter an entire culture. I think when a lot of people my age think about the Beatles, they think about A Hard Day's Night or Twist and Shout or Here Comes the Sun, because those are the specific songs we would have grown up with throughout our childhood. And don't get me wrong, there's actually a very high percentage of teens and young adults that love the Beatles. I believe as of 2019, they make up 30% of their Spotify listeners, so that's really awesome. Beatles are alive and well, but I think there's a misconception of who the Beatles were when at this point in society, and what their best songs are. And I think if you asked a Beatles fan that was my age, like one that really, really liked the Beatles, they'd agree that there's a whole lack of recognition for what they would consider to be the best Beatles songs. Which is why we have to acknowledge the stages of the Beatles throughout the years as a band. So, the Beatles, or the Fab Four, were made up of John Lennon, James, better known as Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. And even though the band saw success at the levels of 13 Grammys and 20 top 100 singles, 5 movies, 13 studio albums, they actually only released music as a band for give or take 8 years. It depends on who you ask. A massive feat if you ask me. Though they are mostly recognized as a Liverpool band, as that's where they were all born and grew up and met each other in forums. They actually, I didn't know this, they put in a lot of work of recording in Hamburg, Germany, and I had no idea, but I thought that was interesting. And after many years of charting at the top of many countries, came the inevitable split. And something we'll get into on the next episode is that this may have been for the best. Although the Beatles split in 1970, their success as a band never dwindled, and still to this day leaves a mark on the industry. Even with a new release in November of 2023 called Now and Then, a song that John had been working on and writing, and he recorded a demo on the piano and he was singing, but it just never made the cut. And this was in 1970, I believe. The end of 1970, he was working on this. But, of course, he was murdered, and time passed, and in 1994, John's wife, Yoko Ono, gave Paul, Ringo, and George the recording, and they were going to take it and they were going to finish it, so they added their own parts, and kind of, like, it ended up being a rough mix, but they didn't have the right technology to do it the way that they wanted to do it. So it wasn't actually until 2022 that technology and AI was good enough to separate John's voice from the piano, because the recording was him playing the piano and singing, and they really wanted crisp audio. So that's why it didn't get finished in 1994, but rather was finished now. So the last standing Beatles in 2022, Ringo and Paul, came together to finish off the single and release it, which again, massive feat if you ask me. I think it's a perfect way to end their discography as well. Getting to hear John sing, "Now and then I miss you, now and then I want you to be there for me. I know it's true, it's all because of you. And if I make it through, it's all because of you." When I went into this process, like I said earlier, I consumed all the Beatles hate I could possibly find, but I also consumed a bunch of podcasts and articles about why the Beatles left such a big impact on the music industry, and I took the time and I watched one of their movies, Help, from 1965. Like, I literally paid to watch it. I rented it separately because it's not streaming anywhere, and I did this thinking it would give me more context to who they were as a band at the time of all their success. However, all I came away with was the fact that there was indeed drugs involved in this experience. And I maybe just don't get filmmaking, but I personally feel like I would take my $250 back. But for me, I've always enjoyed the Beatles when they were on. I just never really would seek them out. That is until I heard Strawberry Fields Forever in a very critical time in my life. I was down by the river journaling. I know, very artsy, but in reality it was not artsy at all. It was actually kind of depressing. I was having just a really difficult day, and I'd put the Beatles CD on because I didn't want to use my phone to listen to music, because I just didn't want to see it. I wanted to be isolated away from my phone. So I threw on the Beatles blue compilation CD I had, and when Strawberry Fields Forever came on, John Lennon sang the words, "Living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. It's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter much to me." And it stopped me dead in my tracks. I realized that life is easy to live when you turn a blind eye to what the truth is, and in turn, you misunderstand what's going on around you. It's an idea that brought me a lot of peace in a time where I felt really alone in defending the truth. It was really one of the only times I've ever felt outlawed in life for my opinion, and I'm a really quiet person, so I don't often speak up, so it was just hard to set a boundary and stick with it and then have the response be not great. It just made me feel really, really alone and like I had made the wrong choice. However, when the Beatles pointed out for me in Strawberry Fields that life is hard when you actually choose to face it. Like, if you want life to be easy, then you can go ahead and you can lie to yourself and you can paint the picture of however it looks to you. But if you're going to face what's actually happened in your life, it's going to be hard. I could have decided to sit back and been walked over and my life might have been less painful, but it wouldn't have been true. And after I let the music actually speak to me rather than just listening along, I wrote this entry. It's interesting that music grows with you. Like, I never hated the Beatles, but now the Beatles mean something to me. Their lyrics mean something, and it makes sense why they have transcended generations. It's the same as Kanye. I always didn't understand why his music was so highly regarded until I just did. It clicked when I hit a certain age, and it's the same with the Beatles. One of my favorite things about the Beatles is also one of their easily most criticized, but it's their simplicity. It's my absolute favorite thing about them. They have many songs in their discography with what I would consider great songwriting. And in my opinion, good songwriting is saying so much with so little. Just like we talked about earlier, living is easy with eyes closed. It's the simplest sentence, yet if you just sit with it, you can understand that it means so much more than just what it says. And for me, the Beatles continue to exemplify in this area with other lyrics like, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. With every mistake, we must surely be learning. Still my guitar gently weeps. Blackbirds singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. And in your eyes, you see nothing. No sign of love behind the tears she cried for no one. A love that should have lasted years. You want her, you need her, and yet you don't believe her. When she says her love is dead, you think she needs you. In my life, I love you more. And to really drive this home, the verse is to all you need is love. There's nothing you can do that can't be done. Nothing you can sing that can't be sung. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game. It's easy. Nothing you can make that can't be made. No one you can save that can't be saved. Nothing you can do, but you can learn how to be you in time. It's easy. Nothing you can know that isn't known. Nothing you can see that isn't shown. There's nowhere you can be that isn't where you're meant to be. It's easy. Really, it's easy. This is a message that I heard from the Beatles when I really needed it, and I feel like it resonates a lot with this podcast. I find myself coming back to the part where John sings, "There's nowhere you can be that isn't where you're meant to be." And again, you can be as critical as you want that, this is a straightforward line and it should be assumed. But I just would disagree. It sends the first message that you're always meant to be where you are meant to be. But if you would take the time to listen, it also tells the listener that where you are is where you work to be. And you're ultimately in control of where you're meant to be. For example, I was just at a concert on Wednesday, and I was there because I was meant to be there. But the reason I was meant to be there is because I had bought the tickets and drove myself into the city. So I might have been meant to be there in time, but I put in the effort to get there. So I think it just sends a beautiful message about, you can take it two ways, right? Like, you can take peace in the fact that where you are in life is where you're meant to be, but you can also take pride in the fact that where you are is where you've worked yourself to get into, like a spot that you've worked yourself to. And I think they're both really, really important messages in life. Now, the question we're asking today is what made them so successful? And I have 2 points to this. The first one, let's just get it out of the way because it's luck. Okay, like obviously luck plays a part in this. I'd argue that it plays a part in probably every musician's careers. Like back in my Zach Bryan episode, if you listen to it, we talk a lot about how part of his very fast success was that the fact that people were craving his music. Country music was in dire need of songwriting, like honest, vulnerable music, and he was there to fill it. Like society wanted what he had to offer. So I definitely think this is part of what happened with the Beatles. There was people that were looking for what they had to offer. However, the Beatles' innovation is not luck, which leads me to the second reason that I believe the Beatles became so successful. The Beatles' ability to test the limits in music was a skill that they brought to the table. They made risk-taking cool, They challenged the listener while presenting it on a plate with a bow. They somehow sold these new ideas to the masses, ideas that ideas that the society had never heard before, and they made it work. They made people want it, and they made people crave it, and that is why they paved the way for the future of music. It's not that they necessarily created the best music of all time, but it's that they created the best music with what they had to offer at the time. The Beatles came to their popularity at a time that people needed something new to invest themselves in. Culture was kind of starting to reject norms, and they were sick of war. You had young women that were rejecting their roles in society, and you had people rejecting the government. So having a band that kind of brought in new ideas with their lyrics, but also new ideas musically, and rejected almost kind of the classic expectation that there was for them, I think people really saw themselves in that and identified with that, and that was probably a big part to why they were more than just successful and why it actually transcended so much time through music and history. Simply put, the Beatles came at a pivotal time in America, and a lot of America embraced that. I'll say it once, and I'll say it again. When music can be a mirror and the listener can see themselves in it, they will embrace it. So it's not to say that the Beatles directly inspired your favorite musician, but they gave perspective in society that allowed people to believe in more than what they had been believing in. It gave them hope and for something to see that maybe they didn't envision there before. And this kind of self-assurance is what passes down through generations, which is why we can see this in the music. And it doesn't only do this with musicians, but also the listeners. And at the end of the day, the thing is, the Beatles might not be the best band in the world, but that's because the bar has been raised. But in the 60s, the Beatles were the one who raised the bar, and that's why they're so integral in the history of music. I was looking through the question, honestly, what makes the Beatles so special on Reddit, and I found this answer and I thought it was interesting. Now, I can't cite the actual account because it's been deleted, but this is what they had to say. I was born too late in 1965 to catch Beatlemania, but I remember feeling excited about a future that I somehow knew would be less constrained than the life my father and grandfather had laid out before them. It seemed to me that the world was saying you can be anything you want. You don't have to fit into the mold of which fit someone else's idea of what you should be and how you should define yourself. I think I got that message from the Beatles. They sang about learning to be in your own time, and all you need is love. We threw off the baggage imposed on us by our forefathers, and it changed the world. And I wanted to bring this up because obviously I can't give you a clear depiction of what it was the Beatles did that created such a lasting impact because I wasn't there. But this person was there, and I thought it was a beautiful testament to someone who did get to experience it firsthand. But that brings us to the end of today. Please let me know what your favorite Beatles song is. As always, all social media and email and sources are in the show notes. Let's let music bring us together, and don't forget to grow up slowly.